so much, just so many places that people probably haven't gone.
You know how many times I've been walking through the woods and I'm on my own course and it said there's no one's ever been right here, and then literally 10 feet later there's a water bottle on the ground just out in the woods.
Sure.
I was like, oh,
Yeah.
okay. What do I know?
Yeah, it's the place is just so
Right.
dang remote.
And also the one thing is High Peaks Wilderness. I mean, don't get me wrong, like obviously there's a lot of remote places, but this wilderness area is not actually what I would consider one of the least traveled and discovered. The other wilderness zones, for example, Five Ponds Wilderness, I think from my calculations, it's like 1,300 square miles. It's north of Speculator, south of Cranberry Lake, and the vastness of that is absolutely ludicrous, like 50 miles wide by 30 miles tall, and it's just like insane. There's no like logging roads in there. There's no like distinct bodies of water. It's just miles and miles of forest that I think there's huge sections that no one's ever been.
Miles
there.
of nothingness.
Well, that's,
it would take days to get there.
I mean, you guys know this from watching the movie, but the movie tends to stick to that like eastern part of the Adirondacks, and I mean, again, we barely scratched the surface of what the Adirondacks hold. I mentioned swamps earlier because there's a lot of like very swampy areas of the Adirondacks, and that's something that people don't realize either. I don't think you don't think of like swamps when you think of that part of the country, but there's a lot of that, and especially actually outside near Whitehall, there's what is it? There's like a nature reserve or something right near Whitehall where there's been a number of sightings. But it's really a swampy location. I flew my drone out there back in 2015 and got attacked by buzzards. It was really funny to watch. But so just the changing landscape there is so different from what people expect as well. And then if you connect, the Adirondacks to like the Green Mountains, to the White Mountains, up into northern Maine, up into Maine, and then into northern Maine. I mean, there's this massive corridor where I think it might even be said in the movie, but you could travel through all of that and never see a single person, like
Big
never
time.
see anything. Yeah.
Sure.
And I don't think people connect that to the East Coast. It's funny too. West, like Bigfooters are really protective of their regions. Like there's a guy named Peter Byrne who's like one of the four horsemen of Sasquatchery, as we call them. And he's like one of the original Bigfoot hunters, was around in the 50s for a lot of the initial expeditions and stuff like that. And Peter, apparently, I just found this out last night, doesn't believe that Bigfoot exists on the East Coast because he said there's no believable witnesses and the terrain just doesn't hold enough cover and food for them, which is comical if you've been to the Adirondacks like that. I think this movie could potentially move some of those people to rethink that position.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, it's weird. It's like the Adirondacks, it's a 1-day drive from 60 million Americans and Canadians. In 2019, I remember reading it was the second most visited park in the United States, and that includes national parks. So people come here, but outside of the Northeast, nobody knows about it. So it's just, it has a smaller amount of people who know about it, but all those people come here. So for example, I work in New York City. That's where I work. I live in Lake Placid. So I'm always driving back and forth. And anytime at work, someone asks, "Oh, where do you live?" And I say, "Oh, I actually live upstate in Lake Placid." 9 times out of 10, they'll say, "Oh, I've been there. It's like, it's 5 hours away, but you've been there because just like people come here.
Yeah.
And it's very popular for people here. But yeah, once you leave the Northeast, like the what's it called? The Adirondacks? Adirondacks. What is that place?
That loose end.
It's a very typical response.
Yeah.
So now you're definitely a filmmaker first, and then you tackle these folklore things second. You wouldn't call yourself a Bigfoot researcher, if I'm guessing correctly. Am I correct in that assumption?
Yeah,
Yeah,
you're very
yeah,
correct. I'm an enthusiast for sure. I'm
sure,
someone
sure.
who loves the subject. I think the subject merits uh merits your time and attention, and
Hmm.
more time and attention than is granted to it, because I think a lot of people just look at it as this fun, kitschy kind of subject.
Of course.
But yeah, I'm a storyteller first, and a Bigfoot enthusiast second.
Sure, sure. So now you mentioned earlier, actually, real quick before I go into that, what was the reason that you guys chose, like that Lake George area? Was that just because it's near Whitehall and you kind of were somewhat familiar? Is that why you started there as opposed to elsewhere?
I'm trying to remember that, but basically, so we chose um, the Lake George area was picked out by Steve Calls, and Steve wanted to go to that Buck Mountain because that's a place where they've had a lot of Bigfoot activity.
Okay.
So we picked that area. If I had to do that all over again, we would have done one night at Buck Mountain, and then night two would have been spent somewhere else, maybe even just closer to Whitehall or over in the Whitehall area. Instead, we did both 2 nights at Buck Mountain, and certainly we experienced some strange things, but nothing too crazy. And the trip was so abbreviated that it would have been great to be somewhere completely different every single night. So it was Lake George on that first night, and then or first 2 nights. But we were traveling all over during the day,
Sure.
especially the Whitehall area and Mount Hadley and all that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of movement, but when we looked at it after the fact, it was kind of surprising to see we had mainly stuck to that eastern side of the park, and then obviously we dipped our toe into Hudson Valley, which is one of my favorite spots in the United States. I was just in the Hudson Valley 2 years ago. Spent a lot of time there doing a UFO project, and I love Sleepy Hollow and the legend of Sleepy Hollow especially, and which is interesting because Kinderhook has that Sleepy Hollow connection as well. That's actually where Irving was when he either dreamed up the book or wrote the book. I'm not sure. He was staying at Martin Van Buren's estate when he met a school teacher, a very bookish school teacher, and that guy ended up serving as the inspiration for one of the characters, Ichabod Crane.
Ichabod Crane, yep.
Yeah. And then Western Massachusetts, obviously, we got there as well. So we traveled a lot, but when you looked at it after the fact, it was just kind of surprising to see how little of that travel, we actually did. Now, for like a really comprehensive look at the East and Bigfoot, you could watch our Beast of Whitehall movie. You could watch On the Trail of Bigfoot: The Journey. And then my friend Alexander, who's in the movie, Alexander Penikoff, he does a series for Small Town Monsters YouTube channel called Beyond the Trail, and he just finished one called the Granite Case Bigfoot Case. That the Granite State, that's what it is, Granite State Bigfoot Case. That's about his look at Bigfoot in New Hampshire, and then he just finished filming a northern Maine episode as well. So those all together, there's like a really comprehensive picture of the Northeast coming together here. We're gonna have to start doing the same thing for like the Pacific Northwest at some point.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that's the thing. It's like there's this idea that they're only in the Northwest is what most people would say until you do a little bit of digging, and then you see, oh wow, there's other things happening in other places. And I mean, so for example, you and young Jonathan over here are both Ohio natives. The podcast Sasquatch Chronicles, which everyone on the show knows I'm a big fan of. The host of that show, Wes, says, who lives in Washington, that's where he's from. He'll say he hears more Ohio Bigfoot encounters than anywhere else in the country. So it's like you wouldn't think that these things are in places that other than the Northwest, but they very much are. And the Northeast is especially when you consider the ADK, Vermont, the White Mountains, and then Maine. And Maine, most of Maine is forest. People don't realize Maine is not just lobsters; it's mostly forest. Right. It just makes as much sense of anywhere that they are.
Yeah, follow the rainfall maps. That's what I always used to when I first got into this. I became obsessed with data, and I was always looking at the rainfall maps. And what's really interesting in Ohio is the rainfall maps have kind of changed. over the years. There used to be more rainfall in the north than there is now. It's a weird map. If you go back like 200 years, you can follow the rainfall maps, but the sightings correspond. The places with the most rainfall in Ohio get the most sightings, and it holds up for almost every state. Like the Ouachita Mountains in Oklahoma. You hear Oklahoma, you don't think Bigfoot, right?
Sure.
But there are a massive number of sightings in the Ouachita Mountain Range in Oklahoma, and that area gets more rain than any other part of that state, and it holds up for the Olympic Peninsula too, because there's tons of rain up there, and their reports are piling in pretty much all the time. So.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. So now, earlier in the episode, you mentioned like people around here they're pretty tight-lipped. They're not really interested in coming on the camera, but maybe they'll tell you some stories. Were there any encounters or any things that Adirondack locals told you that you remember or stick out in your mind that weren't in the film?
I have had more. I've had almost as many Adirondack stories come to me in the years since Beast of Whitehall came out than I have, or as many as I have from here in Ohio.
Okay.
And when we did the premiere for Beast of Whitehall, I probably had 8 or 9 people come to me during that premiere in Whitehall and tell me about sighting reports. Unfortunately, a lot of those just blend together in my head. I think the thing, I talked to a guy who worked at a prison. He's a prison warden there in the Adirondacks. And he has a connection to the Whitehall case through his father, but he wouldn't go on the record. But he was telling me that he and a number of the other guards at the prison had seen Bigfoot. He told me they would never tell anyone about it or go on record, but he passed that info on to me. And he also said he doesn't know of any law enforcement guys who haven't either heard something or seen something for themselves. He said you'll just never get them to go on the record about it. So that's wow. that I'd be curious to talk to some park rangers in that area.
I was just
that's
about
the
to say,
one thing
yeah,
I haven't.
The rangers.
I haven't had that opportunity yet, but I would really like to talk to some of those guys. But yeah, as far as like reports that stand out in my mind, I'm like sitting here struggling to think of details, and I can't recall anything. I just know that I've had a number of those reports come to me over the year.
Sure, I just had a beautiful idea, so I'm gonna give you some homework to when we're over time to think back to those reports, because I'm suddenly coming up with a wonderful campfire story idea for this year's October Sessions episodes, because last year I retold a Bigfoot story that happened here, and I think if I could get you to remember some of those stories, and then I'll turn them into a cinematic campfire story for your ears. I think that would be really fun for October, because I've heard so many stories, especially since doing these October Sessions episodes and these Bigfoot things. It's out there, it's happening. And John, you were about to say something.
A couple weeks ago I had the privilege of hanging out with a bunch of the rangers, like 7 of them, and they were the High Peaks Wilderness Rangers. I mean, there's only about 20 of them here in Region 5. Surprisingly, for all these people they have to babysit. But
keyword babysit.
Yeah, exactly. So, I asked one of the lead rangers, I won't share his name, but I asked him if he had, he's a man of science, he said, and he doesn't necessarily have any reason to believe in that subject up here. He's like, the DC has nothing to hide. If there was any evidence of this or that, obviously we'd come forth about that. But he's like, I've never heard anything or seen anything out here, and neither of the rangers at least that I know of. But I asked him about rangers in other regions of the Adirondacks, and he says, "Oh, you know what? There's definitely rangers down in the southern regions and stuff like that I know that I've heard them talk about and share, saying that they have experienced stuff out there, and even like paranormal things, not necessarily just like Sasquatch related things. So I definitely know, at least maybe not Region 5, which is where we are, but other rangers and other regions of the Adirondacks. I'm most certainly sure that they have experience things just like law enforcement, but they don't really, being in New York State and the way that,